and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Simon spoke with Ferdinand Addis.
So Ferdy is a historian, particularly of Rome. He wrote a big book, a biography of the city, which we talked about that. Also, his earlier work doing some shorter books of a slightly different nature, and his next project going forward.
Enjoy.
So hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. I'm here with Ferdinand Addis. Ferdy, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I wanted to dive right in, as we always do, and start by talking about Elagabalus. Is that right?
Elagabalus, yeah.
Elagabalus.
My favourite, my preferred emperor.
Could you give a brief précis? So he's a Roman emperor of what period?
He's a Roman emperor of the 3rd century AD, and he really comes just at the beginning of what's called the 3rd century crisis.
Okay.
So he's one of the last emperors before, or really he's at the tipping point when a long period of Roman stability and prosperity tips over into a long period of civil war, during which emperors are turning over very, very rapidly. And he comes towards the end of a dynasty, the Severan dynasty. And the result is he has a very, very bad reputation. He is an emperor who...
Bad at the time, or bad in the view of sort of later chroniclers?
I mean, later chroniclers is what we have. So one has to be careful judging what his reputation was at the time, but he was violently deposed.
Yeah.
So, reasonably bad at the time, you can say for sure. And I like him because he was very young. I can't remember exactly how old he was when he became emperor, but he was in his teens.
17,
He was,
really.
and he was brought to Rome as emperor, but really that was a consequence of some very deep politics that was happening. There was a whole family, a powerful family behind him, some very powerful women, his grandmother, his mother, his aunt. And Rome at that stage, you have to imagine a huge empire, an increasingly large sort of state machinery based around the army. And this teenager, gets swept up by the huge forces, brought to Rome, installed as emperor, and really very quickly crushed by those forces. So he's raised up and then smashed down, and history is very unkind to him. They tell stories about they're sort of notorious.
The story, in fact, about the athlete.
Oh yes, well the athlete, That's
You're going to have to relate this.
Am I going to
tell
the story of the athlete? I can't remember exactly where this comes from, but the story is that he sent out envoys across the empire to find people who were exceptionally well endowed. But he loved big manly men. And they found an athlete in Greece who had a Titanic member and brought him before the emperor. And of course, this poor athlete was so undone by fear that the organ for which he had been selected refused to quiver. It hung uselessly. And of course, in the story, the athlete thinks he's about to be executed, thrown to the lions. He very reasonably thinks that that's what's going to happen. But no, the boy emperor takes him rather tenderly, and they sit together in the bath. The enormous athlete, broad-shouldered, broad-chested, and Elagabalus, the boy emperor, nestled, curled up in his arms. And that's the picture that we're left with. And of course, to a Roman historian, this is evidence of the most awful effeminacy and weakness of character.
But it's actually quite to a latter-day viewer, it's rather attractive.
Somehow it is, yeah.
Okay, well, having started literally in medias res, it's now clear to our listeners that you are a historian of Rome. I wanted to fall back to your visit in oversized jeans. Was this when you went to Rome as a teenager, or kind of when did you become interested in the ancient world?
Well, these are two different questions, really. As quite a young teenager, I was a classics nerd, I think it's fair to say. I remember over one summer holiday reading the whole of Livy, which is a sort of, frightful thing to do, really. I mean,
in Latin.
Not in Latin. That
Okay.
would have been really unforgivable. But it's a long book. It's not typically what you read on the beach. But it for me it had the appeal of fantasy almost. It was like reading Tolkien, for example.
Okay.
A new world of heroes, myths, stories that also counted as history. It had the additional frisson of being purportedly true.
Truish.
True-ish.
Truthy.
It was of course a lot less true than I thought at the time.
Okay.
But
what had instigated this? Was it a teacher or a parent or?
I suppose my mother's been interested in Rome for a long time. She actually made a board game about Rome
Okay.
when we were children, and we used to play it. It had Roman. There were Roman games, mini games that you would play while moving your
Ludo.
little.
What is it?
It was not Ludo. It was very, very complicated.
Okay.
Totally of her own invention and
Okay.
with her own art.
Yeah, and do you feel that when are of the same age, that when we were growing up, that Rome, back before Rome was cool, as it were, was it more of a minority?
Is Rome cool now?
Well, I mean, more. It's around a lot.
It's around a lot. It's always been around a lot.
Yeah. Do you think it was more of a minority sport then?
I think it was harder to justify an interest in it as a teenager than it is now.
I mean, I have a photograph.
But that's a matter of
in
age,
my
I think,
study
rather
of
than
me dressed as a legionnaire.
Do you?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. With that sort of thing that hangs over your crotch to protect your
Yes.
made out
Yes.
of milk bottle tops.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
That's so good.
But you were saying, okay, so the interest in Rome, but then you're going to Rome. Where does that fit?
So going to Rome was much later. I think the first time I went, as a sort of independent, conscious human, was on my gap year,
Okay.
and it was a very poorly planned gap year, and we drifted in, me and some friends, without really any sort of plan, and without any money, and without any, without a great deal of focus at all. And in retrospect, it's a moment that writers like to recall when they do their book about Rome. Robert Hughes, the great art critic, did a book about Rome.
And you say everyone makes this up, right? The thing about Gibbon, like saying how he's inspired at a place that wasn't the place at a time that wasn't the time.
Gibbons was a little bit made up, but no, I think in general it's a real moment. I believe these moments. I believe Robert Hughes when he describes his raptures as he first stepped into Bernini's colonnade of St. Peter's. People come to Rome ready to be astounded, and they duly are. And why not? It's an astounding city. But that wasn't, as it happens, that wasn't my experience, because I arrived as a late teenager with, on the one hand, this sort of history, this sort of half-forgotten history, Livy and, a Latin A level, and, so I was still a classics nerd. But on the other hand, I was a sort of drifting teenager living in bus stations of Southern Europe. And we arrived in Rome and ended up on the periphery eating, cellophane-wrapped panini.
Yeah.
And it was just exquisitely unglamorous and uncaptivating as an experience. And I think, I like to think that there's something healthy about that. Because Rome can really... people can be too deferential towards Rome. It invites a sort of reverence that can be obscuring. Rome is a very chaotic, crumbling, sort of dirty, run-down city in many ways. It's a city with a lot of problems. It's a city that has this monumental character that generations of tyrants and popes have tried to add to. But at the same time, it's intensely human. It's very...
What is the population now?
Oh, I wouldn't like to say. I mean, I think it's a small number of millions.
Yeah.
Depending on where you draw the limit.
And what about, you then do a classics degree. How much does that experience of academic study of classics and the languages, how related to that is to what you do now? Or is it a very separate sport?
It certainly is related, albeit indirectly.
Yeah.
I didn't have the idea.
Did you have Greek? Did you do Greek ab initio?
I did Greek as well, yeah. I did Greek and Latin at school and at university. And I didn't have the idea then of doing anything particularly with it. I didn't intend to have a career as an academic or as a historian. And so I suppose I was acquiring knowledge for the sake of knowledge because I found it fascinating, knowledge because classics is very interesting, but it was not directed at anything, and there was a long gap between finishing my degree in classics and returning to classics, sort of 5 or 6 years later. But why is classics... there's an answer to the question, why is classics interesting? But that may not be, this may not be the time to give it.
Go. 20 seconds.
20 seconds. Why is classics interesting? It's the strangeness of it. In classics, you encounter a world that is, in many ways, just like ours. You can read letters sent from Cicero to his friend, in which he reveals concerns that are recognisably human and sometimes feel quite modern. And then in the next breath, he's talking about slaves or conquering Britain, or 1 minute it's familiar, the next minute totally strange. And that applies to Greek tragedy, that applies to comedy.
How important are the languages, do you think, to have the languages?
I mean, that is a difficult question with a lot of with sort of tricky elements to it. That they are important. Reading Latin or Greek in the original is different to reading it in translation. And if you look at just the other day, I was comparing translations of Catullus, mainly for fun, but they're so different. From one Latin poem, you can go in so many different directions. You can be very earthy and, there's. You said I could swear.
You liberally.
Liberal swearing. A translation by Rose Cavani. It was reviewed in the TLS the other day. Renders a line of Catullus, "Fuck you, death. Fuck you, greedy death." I think. And then I looked. There's someone else's version a few years before. I forget the name. Renders it into these very delicate, sort of assonant. Elaborate line, and these are both valid translations. So, in short, the original is worth getting at.
Yeah.
At the same time, the requirement to speak Latin and Greek or to read Latin and Greek puts off people from studying classics who ought to study classics, who you wouldn't want to put off from studying classics.
I mean, what about the basic argument, which I don't shoot the best here, but like it's old, it's boring, it's irrelevant. Like it's the legacy of a failed educational system. All of those, all the traditional arguments that are wheeled out. What are your thoughts about?
I mean, I think there is a case for turning a skeptical eye to classics, especially classics with inverted commas. The very word classics is a relic of a vanished education system. Why do we regard this particular set of authors as classic and others as, I don't know what, degenerate, fallen? Why does this one period of human history, this one little bit of human culture understood in a particular way, establish the class? The idea that our modern Western civilization is uniquely descended from something called the classical period is problematic and should be interrogated.
Yeah.
At the same time, there is this body of literature that exists from Greece and ancient Greece and Rome that does not exist from, the ancient Carthage, for example, that offers a unique opportunity to travel back in time, and that is extremely worth doing.
I mean, I thought it was very interesting. I was reading, I think we talked about this in Italy, but about the production history of Gladiator, the film, which talks about how they had no script when they arrived in Morocco, and Russell Crowe ad-libbed large bits of it, but also about like the battle scene at the beginning, which everyone remembers, and how it's they had the Romans had no stirrups, but they had to have stirrups so people could ride them, and they had catapults, but they never set fire to things, and that scene, which so many people would think of as a sort of Rome thing, is actually like a completely fictionalized notion. It's sort of it's cinema Rome, right? Which is like a recognizable thing.
Yes,
but I just find that it's that almost like it's there are these sort of tropes that you can pick up and create something completely different, right?
No, I mean cinema Rome is wonderful, and it's fascinating watching sword and sandals films from
different periods,
which, and each. It's amazing how they date. I mean, even Gladiator is so recognisably sort of noughties in its
CGI
ethos and concerns, and its CGI. But the that sort of very manly, strength and honour version of Rome, I think actually has fed into. It has become quite influential. The Russell Crowe version of Rome. I mean. All sort of fur cloaks and manly stabbing, and there is this
sandals in the cold. Basically.
Sandals in the cold, yeah. Roman history is a certain vision of Roman history is very popular on, I think, the alt-right, on the sort of online right. Yeah. People love the sort of military trappings of Rome, and this is not, of course, new to right-wing movements. But the idea that Rome was this sort of military marching in step, manly hugging, culturally homogenous superstate is very attractive. With great roads. Yeah. And, from which we in the West are descended in some sense. That has a lot of traction with, a slightly dangerous element on the.
Can we go back then? So just in your own trajectory. So, you do your degree, and then what is your path after that?
So, I had it in my mind that I could be a journalist. I think that was the path that seemed obvious, seemed right to me, and I went to work in television initially as a researcher on documentaries, and it was one of those very formative experiences that you can have, which is formative by being very humbling, and it revealed an enormous set of incapacities that I have. So, in that sense, it was very healthy. But it took, I was there for 2 or 3 years, I think, maybe a bit longer. And the culminating moment, we were making a Dispatches, and it was one of those productions when everything is going slightly wrong and the story doesn't quite hold up, and the deadline is approaching, and we were quite a new team. It was the first time I'd done Dispatches. We were all a bit new, and somehow I ended up trying to organise one of those experiments, those sort of experiment stunts that you do on current affairs TV, where you get people to point at a, guess at something, and then they turn out to have guessed wildly wrong.
Right.
The point was to demonstrate that breakfast cereal is very unhealthy or something.
Okay.
Anyway, I set up I spent all night gluing pictures of breakfast cereal to a cardboard grid. And, in the next morning, everyone arrived, many thousands of pounds worth of camera, crew and equipment. And I had forgotten to organise any members of the public to actually do the experiment. And I didn't realise until half an hour before, it just didn't occur to me that that was something I ought to have done. And it was the most inexplicable lapse.
Okay.
The sort of thing that haunts you ever after, because how you know when you just can't believe you've forgotten something.
So,
you can't understand.
So what happened?
I physically ran up and down Hampstead High Street, grabbing people by the elbow and saying, I will pay you £10 of my money to come and to participate in this experiment. And I think we managed to get, 4 members of the public plus the janitor, the school janitor. It was an amazing failure, and the last time I worked in television. So it was a good.
But of your own volition, or were you fired?
I was not rehired. I was sort of.
And then after that, where do these shorter books, work that we were talking about, where do they fit into your progression?
Well, I suppose that TV had been a great blow to my confidence, let's say. And there was one thing that I was confident that I could do, and that was write reasonably well. And through the grapevine, I heard that someone was commissioning sort of 30,000 word books, the sort that you buy from the checkout at Waterstones. They sit. It's for Michael O'Mara.
Who is Michael O'Mara?
It's a small publishing house. They do lots of these. They do, all the Latin you forgot at school, or
That's fine.
10 things you forgot about trigonometry. I did phrases that come from the classics or from classical mythology.
Okay.
Or phrases that come from the Bible. That was another one.
That you did?
I wrote those 2, yeah.
Okay.
And I also wrote one of the Speeches That Change the World books that come out every year.
Okay.
Every year has a Speeches That Change the World book, and this year
Did the speeches have to be from that year?
No.
Okay.
It's just that it's such a sort of hardy perennial idea in publishing. I think Simon Sebag Montefiore has just done one this year, so that'll be quite that'll be a big seller. But
Gettysburg Address. Nice to see you again.
For whatever reason, in 2009 it was my year.
Okay.
And they were. It was a very precious opportunity for me in many ways, to get my name on the cover of a book. That's how I got an agent off the back of that. The first book I did independently, and then armed with that book, I got agented.
Okay.
My agent then negotiated approximately a 15% increase in the fee for the second book, which was great. But still, it felt like the beginning of
your net take was exactly
was the same. But but it's great to have an agent, and that is the beginning of thinking of yourself as a writer.
Yeah.
So that was a big step, and I started to think maybe this is something I can do. Maybe I can be paid for writing. Not very much.
So we always ask everyone about money on the podcast. Yeah. So how, after you stopped working TV, how were you sort of keeping body and soul together, or were these books paying enough to support you, or
these books? Just so they were the basis. The deal was £5,000 flat fee, no royalty, and it's 30,000 words, so you can do it reasonably fast.
That's still not very much money.
It's not very much money, but the lack of a royalty is annoying because they actually sell quite well.
Okay.
And every so often, nice friends text me saying, "I've just seen your book in Waterstones. I've put it to the front." I feel like saying, really don't put there.
And you were saying these were published not. So your Rome book is under Ferdinand, but what was your nom de plume for these?
That's right. I upgraded myself for the Rome book to my full trisyllable.
Okay.
These ones were published under Ferdinand Addis,
okay,
which is the name I ordinarily go by. But I think, coming back, being published again 10 years or 5 years later, I'm a bit hazy on the chronology. I wanted to, establish a slightly different writing identity, if that makes sense. Because the 3 books I wrote before under Ferdy and this book are just wildly different in terms of scale and in terms of the effort I put in.
And were you doing other stuff in parallel? Were you doing journalistic work or things like that?
So in between the 3 books and the book on Rome, I worked for a company called The Day.
Okay.
Which was a very sort of unglamorous but very worthy job, which was to write news articles for schools, for 16-year-olds. And, I actually regard it, I think it was amazingly good training as a writer, because you have to write incredibly efficiently. You have 300 words to explain who Kim Jong-un is and why some 16-year-old should care about him.
Mm.
And what that means is you have to find a story, you have to find a narrative through line that you can somehow make work in this very short space. And every single word, every character has to be dedicated to that story, has to be furthering the story. There's no space for any fat or any fluff or any digression.
Mm.
And you have to do that, once or twice a day for 5 years. And it really, it
hones you.
It's like doing, it felt like a sort of training montage.
Okay.
It's like doing 1 million sit-ups or something. So I felt like when I stopped doing that, towards the end of the writing process for the Rome book, I felt incredibly lean. I felt like Rocky going into the ring.
And then you were at 648 pages.
Really, ready to put on some weight again.
Okay. And so how does the Rome book come about then? The process of, the life cycle of producing this, how did that work?
So the Rome book has a sort of slightly eccentric trajectory in a way.
We should say this is Eternal City.
Eternal City, Rome, Eternal City,
Mm-hmm.
Rome, Eternal City. And I think I heard of a commission that was going to do a popular biography of Rome in 20 episodes. And I really, I think what they were looking for was someone who was going to be cheap and fast. And that was something I had established myself as able to do with the earlier work. So I put myself forward, I wrote a sample chapter. I said, I'm very cheap and very fast, and I'd love to write your book on Rome. It was absolutely the project of my dreams.
What was the pitch? It was like, this is going to be an episode. So that was
the pitch. The idea, which I think was a really good one, and I wish I could say it was mine, was to do a city biography, but to really explicitly do what a lot of city biographies do anyway, which is to have an episodic structure.
Okay.
And to be very ready to leap from one period of history to the next.
So you're not sort of tied to a chronological...
You're not tied to chronology.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important because a lot of city biographies, I read a few to try and get an idea of the form. They're sort of, they're locked into this awful duty to talk about every single pope and every single emperor.
And there were a lot of them.
There are so many, and it's a sort of wearying catalogue after a while. As a reader, exhaustion sets in, and you can't remember who's who and which pope is which, and also you slightly stop caring when each one person expands the empire, the next person it contracts. One person kills his son, the next person kills his mother. It becomes exhausting. Whereas doing episodes allows you to really dig quite deep into particular stories, into particular themes.
Yeah.
And each episode can be itself quite a good story, quite a that's what I saw myself as doing, writing these sort of 10,000 word short stories almost.
But this is not this book which I'm taking for us. This is not what that commission was for, right? It transmogrified.
Well, it transmogrified, yeah. So the idea was that it would be
done in a year.
Done in a year or two.
How long did it take?
And it took 7. So, and in a way, if I think after 2 years, when or whenever the deadline expired, if I'd said, "Oh, I'm nearly there," that would have been one thing. But I just had nothing to show them. I had just done a lot of reading and written about a chapter and a half. And they could have just withdrawn the advance at that point. But I think in my favour was the fact that the advance wasn't very much. Okay. So, it wasn't necessarily worth their while to take it back again. And there I was, sort of willing to work, obviously not for very much money. And I hope that what I'd managed to provide was sufficiently interesting that they thought it was worth seeing where it went.
And the spread, it was always going to go, to contemporary stuff. You finished with cinema, but it was never going to be like just swords and sandals and stuff like that. It was always going to be the whole. It was always going to be the whole story. It was always going to go to the 20th century. Yeah. I wasn't sure quite where it would end. I think when I started, Silvio Berlusconi was still in power, so I thought that would be a nice ending point. But by the time I finished, that was rather dated. And was that you had this classical training? Was it weird to kind of have to go well outside that, to write about the medieval period or to write about the 20th century or things like that? It was. It was enormously challenging, and involved a great deal of study. But of course, also really good fun. I mean, wonderful to be able to dive into something like Italian cinema, which I didn't know much about at all, and really try to find a way through it. I spent a lot of time with academic papers. That was my method in the library. Where were you working? I was split between 3 libraries. Okay. The London Library, which is a real luxury. The British Library, of course. Actually, 4 libraries. The British Library, the Warburg, is very good. And there's the Roman Society have a library in Senate House, which you can join. Okay. Which is excellent. And yeah, there's something I think good and fresh about arriving in a huge subject, say Italian cinema or the Risorgimento. Which is what? Which is the process of Italian reunification and the rise of Italian nationalism. Arriving in these areas almost like a stranger landing on a strange island, and you sort of hunt around in the undergrowth, hacking through the bamboo until you find a path. A path opens up, some way of setting this great maze of information in some sort of order. And that process of taking, condensing enormously broad, complicated areas down into real stories, that was the heart of what the book was. Mm-hmm. And, I hope I succeeded. In a subject that so much has been written about and so forth, how do you, turn a new furrow or things like that? I think that's really part of it. It's one of the great challenges. How do you justify retreading this ground, which is so well trodden? As a classicist, you always have this problem because there are only so many texts, and they've all been studied ad infinitum. And so I think
what I tried to do was to preserve some sort of freshness of the encounter, if that makes sense. The terrain is old, but I bring myself a new pair of eyes and meet the material. And it produces... I don't know how to explain this. It produces a sort of almost emotional effect. So it's really hard to explain. There's a sort of there's a tradition, a tendency, let's say, in popular history, which is to see the point of popular history as communicating, spreading information. You know, I succeed as a popular historian if you, the reader, learn some facts about Rome. And I think that's fine. But I think you can do more than that. I don't want to just spread information about Rome. I don't want to merely further the public understanding of Rome. I wanted to tell stories that had the power to move. You know, stories that had some of the function of a novel or of a short story. And really, you know, I regard myself as operating almost in the tradition of historical novelists.
Was there? I mean, is we should say that's Freddie's daughter in the background. But was there anything that was fictionalized? Or, you know, how, you know, because, you know, you're not there 2,000 years ago when the scene is happening and things like that. What is the sort of policy with that?
So no detail comes from nowhere, let's say. But equally, I permitted myself to imagine scenes.
Okay. Which
means you can assemble details that should be true into your scene. You can visualize things.
Could you give an example?
I could say the scene of Maxentius riding down the road to the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and then the battle scene that follows. And, you know, accounts of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge are very... you know, a sort of very partial and...
When was the battle?
Short. This was 312. This is the battle at which Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, arrives in Rome and conquers under the sign of the cross, according to the legend. Maxentius is the defeated emperor. I always had a sympathy for the people on the losing end of history. And with a battle scene like that, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what shape the shields would have been, and, you know, whether anyone had horns on their helmets or whether they did a war cry. You try to figure out what became of the Praetorian Guard. Did they slip down the riverbank into the Tiber? What happened to Maxentius himself? People say he was swept away in the river, but you don't know. And from these bits of conjecture, you create hopefully quite a vivid scene.
Sure.
But that sort of work, where you're assembling fragments of information into a coherent narrative, is really a lot like what historical novelists do. They're allowed a little bit more license.
Would you be interested in writing historical fiction?
Very cautiously, yeah. I mean, as I say, I think I'm quite close to that already. And I like this point at which I find myself. I like the restriction, trying to create something that's moving, something that has some artistic merit, a narrative that's compelling, but using only the fragments that we have, that are really there. And if you're allowed to use too much cement to sort of stick the fragments together, too much imaginative cement, that gives you a degree of freedom, but it also, I don't know. And
now, you know, it's published, and you are a popular historian. Can we say that? Is that allowed? And is that a term you embrace?
I think that's a term. I think that is the term.
Yeah.
It's a term
How do you feel about that?
I have, I wrestle with it a little bit. I wrestle in general with the question of where to place myself and what role I can occupy in the sort of great non-fiction ecosystem. My American publisher, in a very what I think is a very American way, put on the front of the cover, they said, "Rome's history brought to life by a master historian." That's what they said, and they submitted this cover. They sent it to me for approval, and I wrote back. I said, that I really, everything's fine, but I'm not a master historian. That's really.
I'm only in the third grade.
Yeah, I mean, and you have people out there like Mary Beard, for example, the doyenne of academic popularizers, whose whole mission in life is to further the public understanding of Rome, and she writes popular histories that are supported by a whole academic career.
How do you feel about
her? I think she does very important work, I would say, but I also I wouldn't aspire to compete with her, and it's not a direction that appeals to me particularly. My book is not meant to be an alternative to her SPQR, for example. Because I think fundamentally she's interested in communicating information, spreading information, and fundamentally I'm interested in causing people to think about the nature of humanity, or the way the world is constructed, or the way humans live within history. So I'm interested in the sort of more general question that, again, I think novelists typically address. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, are classicist popular historians, are they a collegiate bunch, or do they have Byzantine and complicated feuds with each other?
I mean,
backstage at the Hay Valley Hay Festival or things like that.
They may well do. I'm afraid I don't know. I've had a rather hermit-like time of it so far, so I'm not privy to the scandals. Although I know that if you go into universities and talk to,
they hate you, right?
Well, they certainly there's a degree of animus towards people who sell too many copies.
Or any copies.
Or any copies, indeed, yes. I'm doing an event in Cambridge on the 12th, at which various people from the different little pools of, I suppose, classical pop history are coming, and it's quite interesting. It's interesting. I will get to share a platform with some of my academic heroes.
Terrible thing to meet your heroes.
Terrible. And it's sort of very odd to find myself thrown into the same bucket as, for example, Peter Wiseman, who's all of whose books I've read, and
who is
he's a professor at Exeter, and he writes brilliantly about ancient Rome, and he's a huge influence, and so I'm going to feel like a total fraud sitting next to him trying to discourse.
How do you think he will feel?
I fear I don't know. I dread to think.
And can we talk about this experience in Italy that you and I had? So again, we had May on last week, and we were at this residency, and Stirpo Ferdi was there as well. Speak as honestly as you like. There's no need to. But what was your experience of that kind of? We had this residency that we organised, and Ferdi was one of the writers. How did you find that experience?
Wonderful. Very, very
right answer.
Positive. Yeah. No, right answer. No, but it was a very good experience, and it was. I mean, I think what you did very well was create a space. I think that was your ambition, wasn't it? To create almost a blank space, like a blank page on a notebook almost, that we could fill. There were, how many of us were there? 8?
6. Yeah, 6 guests and 3 organisers. Yeah.
Right. And so we had these blank patches of time, morning and afternoon, interspersed with these long set meals and lectures in the evening. And it created a lovely rhythm for the day.
Yeah.
And so I enjoyed that very much. And I enjoyed also the atmosphere created by bringing 8 writers together who I imagine actually none of us would count as a real extrovert, someone who lives for society.
Yeah.
And so I certainly, and I'm sure some of the others had emerged blinking from, the rolling stacks of libraries and so forth. And to be put together in this very sort of collegiate way, it was like being at university. The long table at the restaurant was very inspiring in some ways. And we were all, I think it's fair to say, making an effort.
Yeah,
to
I think so too. The joke
get
was
to know each other
that someone was going to get killed.
That was
going to be a murder, but it didn't happen.
There was an ancient druidic oak on the grounds, the oldest oak in Europe.
We are told, and possibly the largest in Italy as well.
Possibly the largest in Italy. An extremely majestic tree, but also potentially quite sinister. Especially if you've been reading about, wild Celts sacrificing people and so forth, which I happened to have been. But no one got murdered. It was great.
And I think talking of wild Celts, we've got a few minutes before the end. Can we talk about your current project, your next book? So Roman Britain.
Yes, right. Roman Britain.
You speak with such enthusiasm.
No, well, there is. It's very challenging, I think.
We said at the residency, Ferdy was bombarded by factual questions about Roman Britain, whether they had shoes or other items of apparel. Things like that.
Yes, it was.
To which he gave very convincing answers.
Well, that's the
game.
Business. That's the hustle. Roman Britain, yes, and it's very well covered ground, and the path to find a new story or a fresh story on this well covered ground is a difficult one, but I think there is one, and I'm quite excited about it. And it really is to focus on the twin poles of conquest and resistance.
Okay.
I think there's a pathway here.
Okay.
But it's early days.
And how long is this book meant to take?
I think it's meant to be finished in a year.
And how long is it going to take?
I wouldn't like to say. But it's it's very interesting. You say you were asking about money earlier, which I know is a rule of the podcast. And I'm at a stage now where if I can write as quickly as I'm meant to, then it's almost a living.
Okay.
Which is very exciting.
Okay.
It's a modest.
But all the evidence is you absolutely can't write as quick as you're meant to.
Well, that's the thing.
Except in that Ferdinand Addis can, but Ferdinand Addis absolutely can't.
There's something about that last syllable really slowed me down. It's a drag.
Okay. But that's a very interesting way to think about it. So if you were on tempo,
yeah,
you'd be making a living.
I'd be earning sort of minimum wage or something,
Right.
So,
okay.
But
does that mean? Do you think you could work on tempo, or is the tempo just?
I find it so hard. It's really
drumbeat?
Some people are so good, but for me, writing is a very slow. It's sort of slow and meticulous and characterized by a great deal of anxiety, I think. That we probably don't have time to get into this really, but there are people I know who just knock out 10,000 word chapters in a few days, and then they edit them and go over the drafts 4 or 5 times. And I just can't do that. My books grow like stalactites.
Downwards or upwards? which one
is which? Maybe I mean stalagmites up from the ground. Painstaking layers.
Palimpsest.
Yeah, well, except not overwritten. Right, but each line feels like agony, and then 7 years later a book comes out.
I think that is a very good note on which to stop. Ferdy, thanks for being such a fantastic guest on the podcast, and wishing you all the very best with the Romans and the Britons and all the other participants going forward, and with everything else.
Thanks.
Hello, it's us again. Ellie, how are you?
I'm good. I just got back from New York, which is very fun. I really want to move out there now.
Oh, really?
So if my boyfriend hears this, he'll get very scared that
I thought you were trying to persuade him. I thought you were trying to persuade him to move back.
I know, but I don't think that's happening because he's having such a great time.
Are you organising your life choices about a man?
No. Okay, consider me schooled. Sorry. What about you?
I'm good. I've been doing the close of this piece for Outside, which is good, and I've just seen the PDFs, which is very exciting.
What's the piece?
This thing about the French mountain artisan. But I know that we're not allowed to talk about the Alps.
We're actually not.
It's great. There's lots of snow.
Yeah.
So that's good. And the sort of next turns in my book saga, which there's some stuff moving, but I can't talk about that in detail. But
any new commissions?
Yes, but I'm not sure I'm going to do it because the money's not good enough. So
what is the rate you won't allow now?
I'm extremely expensive. No,
I think for our listeners,
you think I should?
Well, we ask our own guests this. So.
I think So I think the point is basically that American magazines pay a lot more than British ones, like a factor of 3 more often.
So $2 a word?
Yeah, $2 a word or north of that. And top British magazines will pay a lot less than that. But this offer I've just had...
So like 40p a word?
Like £3,500 to £5,000 for a long read, something like that.
Yeah.
But I've just been offered like about a third of that. So
shame them. Who is it?
I'm not going to say because we're still in negotiation.
Oh, okay, fine.
Yeah. So, but it's interesting because I can kind of.
How do you negotiate that?
You just send like one emoji. But no.
The poo emoji.
No, that's not what I'll be doing. Anyway.
That's definitely what I would do.
Lean in, Ellie.
Actually, Dylan Jones always said, always ask for 5% more, no matter what the rate is.
Yeah, minimum. Yeah.
Maybe
anyway.
he said more than that because that is quite small.
Yeah, it is quite small.
He just meant for me.
Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Aiken.
And me, Eleanor Halls.
Our producer is Nicola Keane. What do we say now?
If you'd like to find us on social media...
No, there's more. Our graphic design is by James Edgar and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
Because they still listen and care about these credits. If you'd like to find us on social media, it's Always Take Notes on Instagram
and Facebook.
And Take Notes Always on Twitter.
And if you... Well done, Ellie.
Sorry.
Very slick.
And if you'd like to rate, review and subscribe on iTunes, that'd be fab.
And if you would like to contribute to our crowdfunding page, that's on Patreon at Always Take Notes. Thank you.
Bye.